So my topic today, you could already read in the program, is History, Memory, and Politics in the Berlin Republic. This is not to say that I will say something about the entire Berlin Republic, but my focus will be on the changes that were brought about by reunification. I mean, of course, this being a summer school and reunification, this is at the center of our attention. But what I would like to talk about is how memory has been transformed after reunification, how collective memory has been transformed in regard to the commemoration of the phase just before that. So that is of the partition, division of Germany and its cultural memory. I will say something about memory in a second. To start with, I want to tell you a little, well, not a story, but I would just like to tell you what I did last Friday. Last Friday, I went to a dedication of a site of commemoration. That is a site that is in Rostock. We used, even our history department used to have some offices there. So I used to be, or my office was in a former interrogation room of the secret police, which is kind of a strange feeling if you are working in such a space. But this place had been renovated for now, or has seen some renovation works going on for 3 years, and now it was reopened. And the dedication speech was supposed to be given by our state governor, Manuela Schwesig. So Schwesig hält Eröffnungsrede für Stasi-Gedenkstätte und ruft damit Kritik hervor. And I think that is quite a nice beginning. It was, of course, a very official event. You can understand there's a governor coming, security will be coming, then our state minister for education, she also came, and some of the former victims, plus some politicians from the town, plus some people from the university and the respective institutions that are responsible for education and commemoration in my state, or in our state, the state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Pomerania. But if you see the newspaper article, or the articles about this a day after this, you see that her dedication speech drew some criticism, or rather not the speech in itself, but her being there. And you might wonder, well, what's the problem about the governor giving a speech at a site of commemoration that is dedicated to the former, to remembering the atrocities of the former German democratic regime. The point being is that there has been a large discussion going on in Germany on how to, for at least the last 30 years, but always with new facets, a large discussion on the question how to remember collectively the time between 1945 and 1998, 1990. And some of the basic narratives that exist are, first, the narrative of the totalitarian dictatorship, so the totalitarian paradigm, all dictatorships, National Socialism, Cambodia in the 70s, Stalinism, they all are supposed to share a trait, namely the total control over people. So there's a paradigm that sets the totalitarian regimes of the democratic regimes. This is one of the basic paradigms that exist in commemoration as well as in politics, of course. But there are others, of course, and the GDR, of course, that itself had a paradigm, an anti-fascist paradigm, where they saw democracy via capitalism, democracy and fascism as something that is interlinked, and they always pointed at the elites of the National Socialist time that were reused or had their chance in the newly formed Federal Republic of Germany, that is West Germany. And in that entire discussion, there's within the people that are from former, I mean, it's a nationwide discussion, but here it's especially hefty in those regions that used to be part of East Germany. And so there was, on the one hand, our governor, who is from a central left-wing social democratic party. And on the other side, there was one of the victims themselves, who is now a leading figure, indeed, a leading figure in the in the state Christian Democratic Union. So that is the center-right party in Germany, as you may well know by now. So there's the basic paradigm being the center left governor trying to find a position where not all those who used to support the regime, or at least who didn't clash with the regime, would be made part of or would be considered part of a totalitarian state. Whereas on the other hand, especially if you are a victim, the stand of the other side was that in a country that didn't, in a dictatorship like East Germany, each and every action that you take can be considered part of a dictatorial system. This might be an academic debate, but it's very concrete, or it gets very concrete in the very moment when this is about whether parties should be able to continue to work. The right or the center-right party, or parts of the center-right party, always think that the very left party, which is now called the left, should not, or should be banned, for example. That would be one rather extreme demand, but basically they or whether they were allowed to keep their party property and stuff like that. So basically this is all about different views on history, collective views on history, and our governor had put chosen in before this event, or she has been choosing this for about 3 or 4 years, a position where she says, well, the GDR was not a lawless nation, an Unrechtsstaat. So this is the Unrechtsstaat debate, the lawless nation debate, which captures some of the attention of the media even in this time. So this was just a very recent moment, and it may show you that talking about collective memory, especially in a context like the one we are discussing here, can be very contentious. There's arguments, there are arguments, there are debates, and there are political clashes that adhere to the discussion on how to interpret the past and how to gauge what answers the past may give us. This is just one example of how how complicated it is to talk about the way that the East German history and the history of East Germany and West Germany in the time of the division of the partition of the country is being remembered today. So there are numerous ways to remember this. There are clashing views on how to remember it. And I think this is why this is worth talking about for some time within this summer school. Just some very few remarks on the theoretical background in memory studies. Memory studies, of course, owe a lot to the French sociologist Maurice Halbwachs, who in the first half of the 20th century coined the term, or at least made it well known, the point collective memory. And within the German-speaking countries, but also by now in some of the English discussions, there's Janet Aleida Assmann, who have contributed a lot to this debate, continuing on or adding on to what Maurice Halbwachs had to say. Most of the things from Assmann's are from the 1980s and 1990s, but they are still very influential today as a theoretical paradigm with which to gauge memory phenomena, especially collective memory phenomena. And what's very important there is that they distinguish not only between an individual and a collective memory, but that they distinguish between two different forms or degrees of collective memory. So whereas the individual memory is, of course, based in your own head, basically. Of course, even our individual memory is, we all know this from testimony after 10, 20, 30 years. Individual memory owes a lot to the groups you are interacting with, the people you are interacting with. So even this is part of something that's construed. Memory is something that is ever and ever again construed again. But what's of more interest here is the fact that collective memory can be distinguished in two spheres, and these spheres are called communicative and cultural memory by the Assmanns. Communicative memory being the memory of the face-to-face interaction. Your mother, your father, your parents, your teachers, friends tell you something, or you as a group tell yourselves something about the past, either the one you have lived through or the ones that they have lived through. So it's this face-to-face communicative communication on history or on the past that is so important, and that the Assmanns define as communicative memory. Whereas then there are different more distant ways of telling about, or less direct ways of talking about the past, and there you need objectivations and artifacts and rituals that enable, or that can transmit certain ideas of how the past should be interpreted among a broader, either a group or even an entire population. Just to give you some examples, or very quickly, some examples. And generational memory is also a very interesting word that is more or less adheres to the communicative memory, meaning that different cohorts, segments in a society, or different age groups have different experiences as a group, or share similar experiences. So that very often what happens is that certain groups have certain certain ideas about how to view things about the past, whereas other groups have others. And then, of course, the government or institutions or even companies come and share their own idea about history. So this is my father, by the way, in an attempt to take a WhatsApp picture. I brought this picture of my father because this is a very good example from communicative memory in my own family, and this is exactly right in the middle of the topic of my presentation today. When we are talking about German or Central European history in the 20th century, I belong to the generation, I'm 51 now, I belong to a generation that has been told, or some of us have been told, and I belong to those people, quite a lot by their parents and grandparents about the past of the German partition, but even more so of the past, of the National Socialist past and World War II. So my father, who's quite old, he's still alive, luckily enough. He was born in 1932, so he's 89 now. But having been born in 1932, he more or less, of course, was a member of the Hitler Youth. And I got an uncle, by the way, who at age 19 died as a German soldier at Monte Cassino in Italy, which is kind of bizarre because I don't feel like I have an uncle. My individual feeling would not be that I have an uncle that is a Second World War generation. But my father was rather old when he got me, and his brother was older than he was. So there is a relation between both, or there are lots of stories, plus my grandparents have told a lot about the Second World War. There are a lot of stories, or there used to be a lot of stories going around about the war, but especially about East Germany, because my father belongs to that group that grew up in what used to be, what was in between the German Democratic Republic. And he basically fled the country in the 50s and moved over to West Germany. So he has both an East German and a West German stance on the German Democratic Republic. And of course he was, and he even took me even in the 80s, he took me to the GDR. And of course, my own view on East Germany and the German Democratic Republic is heavily influenced by the experience he opened up, by the relatives he introduced me to, by my grandmother, who was my other grandmother, who was from Saxonia. And even until today, his views on, by now, of course, I'm a historian, and I would claim that I have many more sources of information, but some of the basic paradigms certainly are heavily influenced by what he told me about the past. And this is something entire studies have been done on the on phenomena like that. A famous book by Harald Welzer, where he used interviews, 3 generational interviews, was a granddad wasn't a Nazi. That's the very telling title about how these stories are told within families. So when you come at this time, if you go to Germany, you have quite different generational memories. First of all, there's, for example, parts of the West German population who didn't have any contact with East Germans before reunification, or hardly any. And to them, they had no part, or their communicative, there's lots and lots of people in West Germany in the 1980s and 90s whose, or especially in the 80s, whose collective memory that didn't have, or whose communicative memory didn't have any connection to East Germany. East Germany would be further away than, for example, the Netherlands and your cottage at the North Sea coast, just to give you one example. However, on the other hand, there were people like, for example, myself, who had relatives, so they were, or who were interested in themselves, not interested in themselves by themselves. So there were other groups that were heavily interested in the German Democratic Republic. Then, of course, you had within the population of the German Democratic Republic people who were very strongly opposed to the regime, people who more or less got along. And then, of course, those who were in conflict with the regime and thus have entirely different experiences. Just imagine your father either having been maybe even a Stasi executive or a Communist Party member on the one hand, and on the other hand, your father may have, or your grandfather may have been somebody who was imprisoned by the secret police. And sometimes this even runs within the same family. Just imagine your one grandfather or grandmother being a victim of persecution, and the other half of the family being either functionaries of the party or in whatever function else. So these are generational memories even within the generations that clash. So much for communicative memory, but you can imagine that even today, it's very interesting to see how much of the GDR is still in the minds, or even of West Germany before reunification. That would be is another interesting question, whether Germany is construed as the normal Germany being the West German history, and then kind of like the other German story being the East German story, or if you don't have this at all. So there's interesting and different communicative memories and different generational memories on the past of the partition and on either on either half of the country. If you now come to the cultural memory is something that is much more structured, where, for example, books or documentaries, or even fictional movies, computer games, textbooks in schools, monuments, street names. So all these occurrences where history is high, or the thinking about history is not as flexible as when it, as within a relation, a direct relation between parents and children, but where you have a certain kind of fixedness. And I think one very good example on how this works is stamps and coins. Stamps and coins nowadays are in the few chances for a government to visualize certain ideas about the past. Coins and stamps always used to do this, or not all, well, yeah, other story, but for a very, very long time, even during the Roman Empire, of course, the coins had a certain, or not a certain, had a definite symbolism and a political position that was printed or coined onto them. And it's quite interesting to see that with the introduction of the euro 20 years ago, the members of the EU, the nations that would be members of the European Union, or first European Community, then European Union, that they would lose their money and thus a chance to transmit a message, a political and historical message through the coins. But interestingly enough, after first phase, where the basic currencies of all or the versions of all the currencies of each nation has a slightly different version of the of any of the coins, but very soon there were like special coins. So every country has like a normal set of coins where the rear side is always the one that's individualized, the front side always being the same all over Europe, but the rear side is the one that gives the chance to individualize by nation. And then there's the normal coin, which is don't have any money in my pocket right now. And then there are special coins. Some people collect these. Yeah, of course, as a historian, I do this, where some historical event is portrayed. And I think it's quite interesting that in spite of the urge to unify the money, the governments or the states, the nations that are members of the EU still get the chance to individualize their coins and bring a certain story about the past across. Of course, stamps are another form of official, or where a nation can concentrate on some very, very important historical events that seem to define or participate in defining what the country wants itself to be portrayed as. And I chose this to show you the delicate or the fine distinction that can be made between different narratives, even within one state. You could say, well, it's both a coin and a stamp. It's both on the federal level. They should convey more or less the same message, but they don't, in fact. The coin, it's both the coins and the stamps celebrate 50 years of Chancellor Willy Brandt kneeling before the Warsaw Uprising, a ghetto uprising monument in Warsaw in 1970. That was right at the time of the of a first attempt to, or second rather, to alleviate the Cold War, or to bring the Cold War to an end, or at least alleviate the situation of the people. And so this was highly debated, not only the kneeling down, but the entire Ostpolitik, the Eastern politics of Chancellor Brandt, how to deal with East Germany, how to deal with the other Warsaw Pact countries. But even so, there are two narratives here that are more or less competing with each other. So if the kneeling down is about the relation between Germany, and here it was West Germany and Poland. Of course, one of the main issues was the question of territory. The territories Germany lost to Poland after World War II, and the people who had been driven out of there and had, by the way, settled both in East and West Germany. But that's, of course, was a highly controversial political issue in West Germany. Plus the way how to deal with the past, how to deal with atrocities of the National Socialists or of the Germans during World War II and before World War II. So the coin more or less concentrates on the Jewish or the the question of the persecution of the Jews. So you see the menorah, is the chandelier with the 7 candles, typical symbol for the Jewish faith. And then you see him kneeling before the monument. And the monument itself, by Nathan Rappaport, is a monument that displays or that is centered upon the Jewish resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. So this coin puts the kneeling down in the context of how to deal with the persecution of the Jews as a leading figure. It's not the head of state, of course, but number 2, the chancellor, of course, is the head of government. But basically, it's telling you something about the position of the government, of the country, of the nation. And so this is more or less, the coin represents the position that he took, in spite of criticism, that he took in respect to the persecution and destruction of the Jews in World War II, or before and in World War II. Whereas the other visualization, the stamp, does something slightly different. You don't see any Jewish allusions here, any allusions to the fact that it was the Jewish ghetto or the rest of the population that was left over, had not yet been sent to the death camps that were responsible for the uprising in 1943. But all of this context is not being alluded to in the stamp, but here it is about German-Polish relation, the relationship between Germany and Poland. So you see, with the stamp itself doesn't show, doesn't really give it away, but the framing of the stamp here with a Polish soldier, and of course this being a media event, all the journalists in the background. So even here, the Germany as a country, as a reunified country, celebrating this in 2020, shows that this part of West German history is considered, which is of course very important in the context of East-West relations, or it's even pivotal for East-West relations in the 1970s. So here something is celebrated by the nation, or commemorated by the nation, whereas any of the deeds that were done by East Germany in the 1970s certainly don't make it on a stamp anymore. So in this sort of like West German history, but one that was very pivotal for the development of East-West relationships, here are at the center of commemoration of the reunified country. But even so, 2 different versions. One rather emphasizing the question of the destruction of the Jews, one rather emphasizing the East-West relationship in relation to nation states and their relation to each other. But this would be very, very good examples of cultural memory. Something I want to show you, unfortunately, of course, we in pandemia and in the times of pandemia, we all have been getting used to these, more or less at least, to this kind of learning. And of course, it's most unfortunate that we cannot convene and meet in person in Rostock, but I want to at least give you some insights and some pictures from Rostock to show you something about commemoration and how this, I could have used other examples from other towns in West and East Germany, but I wanted to focus here on Rostock so that you get an idea. This is the youngest and newest monument. Of course, one can argue about the importance of monuments as far as views of the past are concerned. Monuments are the one chance for a government or a governmental entity to bring forward its position on a certain aspect of the past. However, the influence of, or how influential such a monument is highly debatable. Like very often you will just pass by a monument, and you can, even if it's a very famous monument, you can stand next to the monument and just approach some passers-by, and you will see that a high percentage of those people who will pass by have no idea about the significance of any monument that is right in front of them, maybe with the exception of very, very famous monuments like the Statue of Liberty. But the everyday monument does run a chance to not really be at the heart of collective memory. But it's very interesting to talk about these monuments because they are so focused, and because they show, if you want to learn something about the government or the state and its different ways of commemorating, these documents or these monuments, of course, are a great source. And this is just a column for the 1992 riots, the anti-immigration riots that were a major event in the early 1990s. And this is the way it is remembered. It's one of 6 columns. One can argue about whether it is whether monuments should be abstract, so you cannot by yourself see or decipher the meaning of this monument. You can do it yourself, but you have to get information. You have to inquire a little bit about it. It's not something that is speaking for itself. If we now turn to a more systematic view on how the way the recent past was, so the history or the period of division, of partition, was commemorated and has been commemorated in the Berlin Republic, I want to point out 4 aspects. My first and most important aspect would be to give you the general idea of what was happening as far as commemoration is concerned at the very moment when the German Democratic Republic ended and became a part of the Federal Republic of Germany. The federal meaning, of course, that's a federal state and all that is implied by that. I already did a little bit of 2. Then I want to show you some of the memory, some of the monuments here, and try to at last give you an idea about some of the changes. So of course we are talking about the ever since 1952 highly centralized GDR into the merging with the federalized West German Republic. This had very, very this had extremely fundamental consequences on the basis of any commemoration in the public sphere. Of course, if you have a monument in the public, there needs to be some legal reasoning, or there need to be it's not that it happens, but these are usually ephemeral monuments. But usually you cannot just erect a monument by yourself, but you have to get either permission, or it is the government or the state itself that is responsible for erecting monuments, especially in a highly centralized country like the German and dictatorial country like the German Democratic Republic that didn't have a federal separation, a vertical separation, a system of separating powers as a federal state Germany, for example, or in the US or in Australia has. Within the German Democratic Republic, you had your grip as a government, as the communist government had a grip on the commemorative language. The way they had a certain, they had a lot of power to determine how the past, especially the more recent past, that is of the German Democratic Republic itself, and especially of National Socialism, is to be visualized. What are the leading narratives? But all this changed overnight. So ever since the reunification of October 1st, or the Länder, the states even had been reintroduced some days before that. So the Länder are older than the reunification. by a couple of days. But even so, the newly introduced Länder, of course, were one sphere or like the word one tier where decisions could be made about monuments. So before 1990, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern didn't exist, then it existed. And as Mecklenburg-Vorpommern or Brandenburg or Saxonia-Anhalt or Thuringia, all these newly reinvented Länder states were now responsible, for example, for setting a historic agenda and for giving for funding, for example, monuments, or for giving the permission to erect a monument. Plus, of course, there is a federal in a federal system like Germany's that knows a vertical separation of powers. You have the nation, the federal level. So some of the decisions are made on the federal level. Then you have the state level. Decisions on monuments can be made there. And then you have the local level. The city of Rostock as a local entity is free to either finance or not finance, or to erect or not erect monuments. So this was a very, and monuments are only one facet of the entire portfolio of elements where history is conveyed, or that convey history. So one of the results, and this is true for a lot of topics and for a lot of matters, governmental matters. However, in as far as commemoration politics is concerned too, there was from the outset, just by this being a federal system now, there was food for a pluralization of the messages that would be conveyed, meaning simply that now competing narratives about the past had the chance to get into an argument with each other and had a chance to be seen in the public sphere. So this is a process that I've at one time called the pluralization of commemorative science, or rather the pluralization of collective memory on the recent defunct GDR after reunification. The pluralization can be observed in numerous subfields. So first of all, in a highly centralized form of government, you have some agency or some post in an agency that is responsible for that. Maybe you have 2 or 3 in different layers, or in different again, I like the word, in different segments of a government. However, it's nothing to be compared with what a pluralized democracy can offer. So alone through the 3 layers, federal, state, communal, or local, plus the point being that, of course, competing parties would be elected in different entities. So you can have a social democratic state government, but a rather conservative or even strongly conservative a local government. As you know, we have at this time a coalition between Social Democrats and Christian Democrats at the national level. But in other states, for example, among the governors of the states, you find persons from the Green Party, even from the leftist party, from the Christian Democratic Party. So, and this changed, of course, over the years through election. So there's lots of chances to have different agents. Plus, now you could have agents from the evolving civil society that were able to put their point or their view on certain elements of the past in the public sphere. Then, of course, you have the pluralization of the political debates. In a dictatorship, usually you don't have freedom of speech. The very moment that you have freedom of speech, media, press, that you have a pluralization of political debates. And those reflect, of course, in the commemoration politics and in the ways, for example, monuments are erected or curricula are being made for schooling, or restitutions for atrocities or for having been subject to atrocities. All these rules are a matter of political debates. And then, of course, you have the rituals that change. There were quite, we'll show you one or two examples. There were rituals, very militaristic, for example, rituals in the GDR. And after reunification, we have a pluralization of rituals in different commemorative settings. As far as the change, the transition is concerned between the partition and reunification, one of the major aspects is the very, very quick annihilation of the German border in 1999-1990. And there were these Mauerspechte, wall sparrows, as they were called, that were, so you took a hammer and a chisel and you got your own part of the Berlin Wall, and it was demolished within within a very brief time. And today, if you take the train from Hamburg to Berlin or from Nuremberg to Berlin, you will not see the border unless you really know where it is. So there's a question about the border and its annihilation and how this is part of the collective memory. And there are some spots where the German border has been retained, or some traces that have become centers of or focal points of collective memory. Then, of course, this is what I tried to explain, the separation of powers and the pluralization that led to a numerous debate, or to a whole conundrum of ideas about history that are displayed in the public. And again, not all of what has been, this is something that's especially true for West Germany in the 1980s, the development of a history movement. And ever since the 1990s, civil society has taken its hold, but not only on West, but also in East Germany. So there's a high number of institutions that do have a certain view on history and want this view on history to be recognized. Then there are involuntary memories. It's very easy to link these to our individual memory, where you have like a voluntary memory, you try to remember something, you have an involuntary memory, memories that come into mind when you eat something, for example, and you remember days long gone. So although individual and collective is quite different, and you always must remember that the vocabulary that we use for collective memory very often is derived from words that are originally rooted in individual memory. And this is sometimes sort of misleading, because what may be true for, usually the metaphor comes to an end at a certain point, and beyond that, it doesn't really have a lot to explain. For example, collective trauma, that is something entirely different in the mechanisms that unfold in a trauma in an individual that suffers from it. So, but even this caveat may not or should not deter you from talking or from seeing this this building for a brief time. This is, of course, as I said before, if you go from Hamburg to Berlin, you don't see the border anymore, but after about 10 or 15, now about 10 kilometers, the very first station there is this concrete building. And this is something that you could consider one of the foremost, it's the last of the big Grenzkontrollabfertigungsstellen, Grenzübergangsstellen, the border control posts of the former GDR. And it has been abandoned. It's not yet demolished, but it's certainly suffering. So we don't know how long this building will exist. And at this time, it's a memorial without the intention of it being a memorial. But of course, you have a, whenever you pass by it, and all those who know what it is are always reminded, oh, yeah, that was the border. And think of all the stories that go with it. However, so there is some marking on it, but this marking does not pertain to the fact that this is a building that is very, very much attached to the suppression system within the German Democratic Republic. Instead, it's been usurped, you could say, or it's been conquered by an entirely different imaginary paradigm, and that's the football or soccer paradigm. So the FC Hansa is the Rostock Football Club, and within 100 miles, about 150 kilometers from Rostock, if you draw the line, you will see that there is also always FC Hansa, FC Hansa, FC Hansa. I found this quite interesting because here there's something entirely different that's alluded to. Hansa is the sometimes called the precursor of the European Union, but it's the trade agreement between the towns and between the Hanseatic towns in the Baltic, North Germany, and in the North Sea region. So this is the Rostock Football Club carries, and also the ship is very important in the emblem, carries or carries a name that alludes to the medieval history of the town that it resides in. And all this is on the building that is or could be, if there were anybody interested in investing the money, that could be very well used as a site of commemoration. As far as, if you concentrate on monuments, as far as monuments are concerned, after reunification, the large problem or the challenge was, of course, what to do with the monuments that were already there. And this, of course, is only valid for East Germany because the entire country or East Germany became part of a reunified Germany, but the continuity of government and of symbolism is, of course, in the West. So there was no reason whatsoever to change the memorial landscape in the West, except that, of course, the fact that it's now a reunited country will be celebrated in all parts of the country. So that's an entire question. That's the way how to symbolize reunification. There were also some partition monuments in West Germany as well. But this is one big issue in the, especially in those regions that used to be East Germany. How should we commemorate, what kind of monument should we use to remember the time of the Soviet occupation and of the German Democratic Republic? So then, of course, there are the monuments that already were there in 1989. What to do with the monuments that the DDR erected? Do we preserve them, or do we destroy them, or do we just let them rot? Then, as a very as a typical problem or challenge for German memorial politics, it's always the question how to relate or how to, what paradigm to use when talking about the National Socialist past. So you cannot talk about the GDR past without realizing that the partition itself, of course, was the result of the lost war and the downfall of the National Socialism. And so both countries, both parts of the country needed, or chose at one time or another to commemorate especially the atrocities of National Socialism. And then, of course, there's the question, okay, now the country is reunified, what do we do with those monuments, with this kind of monument? And then that's something that really demonstrates pluralization. New groups could now, or old groups that were newly introduced into what was the former, or what formerly was the GDR, new monuments can be erected, new initiatives can be taken to, or can be implemented to remember the past. And just two examples are the monuments for displaced Germans or displaced people from the former German territories, and the rather general monuments for the victims of war and violence. So those would be newly introduced types of monuments. In 1990, there were lots. This is from West Germany. In fact, this is from only 30 or from only 300 meters away. I'm in Bavaria, in the northern part of in Franconia, or Lower Franconia, which is part of Bavaria. And at this time, so about 300 meters from here, there is an oak tree that was planted in 1990. And in 1990, there was a plaque that remembered, or that said that this oak was planted, this oak tree was planted in commemoration of reunification. And you see how the bad shape in which this plaque is. So this is only 30 years. This is the one of the youngest acquisitions in the memorial landscape. That is, or rather, one of the more recent events in history that is commemorated here. And even now, even after such a limited time, this plaque has lost all its meaning. It's even lost its letters. So obviously not too many people here were too keen on keeping this plaque that would commemorate reunification in shape. But this is not the rule. This, you see, this can happen. So even after a relatively short time, other generation after the first generation doesn't obviously here doesn't feel the need to commemorate this. So so this sign, of course, is in much better shape, and this is quite telling. These brown signs are to be found in just about any major highway and on the autobahn, on the interstate, on the freeway, where the former border between East and West Germany is crossed. But this is not by coincidence. So whereas the derelict, the plaque that I showed you that was in such a big shape, that is in the responsibility of basically, I think it's from the local Christian Democratic Party that was responsible for planting that oak tree. And obviously that, well, if you call the party part of civil society, that would be another thing, but another issue. But it's not a governmental, it wasn't governmentally issued. But still, this is different here. These signs, and there are several hundreds along the former border, always following the same type. So they will always say, okay, at this particular point here, the partition or the wall was torn down at this particular date. Here it is November 12th, 1989, 8 o'clock in the morning. So these will be individualized, but they always follow the same pattern, always look the same, like that here. And the fact that they do that is, these signs are being sponsored by a large institution, the Bundesstiftung Aufarbeitung, that has been installed after 1990 to be responsible for the commemoration of the former German Democratic Republic, or the atrocities and the dictatorship. And they do things by themselves, but they also support other groups that will do some research, or will have a commemorative project, or will do work with school children, for example. So the fact that this is in much better shape than the one I showed you before is directly linked to the fact that there are institutions, in spite of a pluralized society in which a lot of institutions can do something, or can put their view on history in the public sphere. Only larger institutions that have the financial funds and the governmental backing are able to find a way of commemoration that is really very present all over Germany, or at least all over the present, all over the former border. This is a more individualized version. That's a stone, but of course, this being, I said something about the importance or non-importance of monuments for everyday life. Of course, they are important when they are dedicated, and usually one of the leading figures in the government, be it state level, local level, or federal level, will be present. So last Friday, it was our state governor. When this rock here was erected at one of the border crossings in Lübeck, in the very north of Germany, between East and West Germany. Our chancellor of 16 years, Angela Merkel, came to dedicate this stone. That's another monument that commemorates the times of the changes. So this is in contrast to these brown signs that you can find everywhere. This is a highly individualized plaque that reminds passers-by, and I always wonder how many people will look at this, commemorating first the church as a room for opposition in the ending phase of the German Democratic Republic. So here what is commemorated is 1982, the start of the peace prayers that were one mode of expression, of expressing criticism or differing opinions to the SED regime in of the socialist regime in East Germany. And then November 7th, 1989, there was a large gathering of people praying, 25,000 participants, which is really a lot in Meiningen, which I think is a town of 50,000 or 60,000. And of course, people came from the surroundings too. And then 2 days later, the fall of the wall or the form of the border between West and East Germany. So this is more individualized than the ones we have seen before, but it's directly linked to the place where this has been taking place. Just 2 more examples. There were roundtable discussions, and early in 1990 there was an artists gathering in Schwerin, and one of the artists, Schwerin, the capital of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and one of the artists decided to erect or to make this rather abstract round table monument. So here again, you have a monument that needs explanation. You can go to the wall or the place where I took the picture, but in this picture, there's another plaque that tells you, or an explanatory text that tells you what this monument is about. But what's very interesting is that this is not the original point where it was erected in the early 1990s, but that was the original place which is now the background where you see these white columns in the in front of the building far away. That's the market, and this was the original point where this round table monument was placed. So basically, at the very center of Old Schwerin, in the early 1990s, there was a monument that would be commemorating the end of the peaceful end of the GDR. So, but this doesn't last. So then the city of Schwerin, that's a city decision, a communal decision. The city of Schwerin decided that this message is not important enough for the very center of the market, so they relocated, as you have seen, they relocated the round table monument. And again, we have the Middle Ages as a point of reference. And they changed it to have a monument of the Line, and that's always alluding to Henry the Lion, who has been the founder of a whole score of towns in the 12th century. So the Duke of Saxonia, well, that famous Saxonia. Saxonia today is not what Saxonia used to be in the Middle Ages and the early modern times. So the entire northern half of, or northern third of Germany would be Saxonia in those times. So Henry the Lion is alluded to here. So we have a shift from a situation where after 1990 the events that had led to reunification and the downfall of the regime would be commemorated in the center of the city, to a situation where the medieval roots are commemorated. So that's a change of paradigms without erasing the story, but simply relocating it. Of course, then the next question was, what do we do with the monuments that the GDR has erected? And just remember, remember 2003, many of you will not remember, but when the US invaded Iraq, one of the first things that happened and after the downfall of Saddam Hussein was the toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue in Baghdad, which was a media event par excellence in 2003. So this, of course, is one chance. What you can do is you can topple the monuments. And this has happened, especially in Rostock. In many places in the GDR, there were tanks like that, T-34 Soviet tanks that would be on display commemorating the victory of the Red Army in 1945. There's, I think, two or three of these tanks are left in East Germany, but more or less all of the others are have been put down. Or, for example, there was a very famous one when you entered Berlin, coming from West Germany, re-entering from the GDR in the major border point. There was also a tank like this, and I can't remember. Sometime in the 90s they would put it. I have no idea what they did with it, by the way. In Rostock, the largest, there were some, whether you would topple a monument or not is not really foreseeable. So there's no clear picture under what circumstances the monuments that the GDR had erected would be toppled. You cannot even, of course, one would think, well, if you have a government on the city or local or state or national level that is where parties with a certain idea of history, or where different parties are in power, and so different parties would be able to bring their view on history in the public sphere. So you would say that maybe once you have if the left-wing party is part of the city or the state government, then you will have more, or then we may encounter more monuments from GDR times that survive. Or else, if it's a Christian Democrat, for example, government, more would be toppled. It's not as easy as that, unfortunately. There is a tendency that you can show that would support this view, but it's more complicated, and very often it's simply chance. More often it's people have to have an interest in removing a certain monument, and as long as there's no legal obligation, there's a legal obligation not to have National Socialist insignia or monuments in Germany. So these were systematically erased. And some of our Eastern neighbors, some countries in Central Eastern Europe, have laws where they ban both National Socialist or Fascist and Communist or Stalinist imagery. However, in Germany, it's only the ban on National Socialist imagery. So you can take a Soviet flag and wave it around as long as you want to, but you can't take a swastika, the National Socialist flag, and wave it around as long as you want. So that's the difference. And in Rostock, there was one of the biggest monuments that survived, largest monuments that survived social realism, that would be commemorating the revolutionary sailors of 1917. So this is a rather impressive monument at a very impressive position in Rostock, but nowadays it's a little bit in, it definitely needs some repairs now, but in the end, the city has decided that it will now renovate this. It will not restore all of it, but the basic, the metal monument will be retained, and these murals will be retained as well. In other instances, of course, this isn't the case. If you just remember the major building in the center of Berlin, the Palace of the Republic, that the heart of the German Democratic Republic was torn down and is now supplanted by a copy of what was before there, and that's the rather boring, sorry to say that, castle of the royal castle of the Prussians, of the Hohenzollern. But at other places, even a Lenin survives. Yeah, you would think that Lenins wouldn't have a lot of chance of survival, Lenin monuments, but there is one in Schwerin that still exists. There has been a lot of controversy about it in the 1990s and early 2000s. I think my impression in the meantime is it's so exotic by now that there is no interest or that the impetus to get rid of this Lenin monument is not large enough to really bear fruit. However, what happens is that it's one of the monuments that gets sprayed on every once in a while. And of course, some of the spraying of the graffiti will be anti-communist, but in this case, or maybe it's ironic too, I can't really tell. Somebody has sprayed Karl Marx is still alive on the Lenin. Well, whatever to make of that. But even that, like there's a Lenin ring, so the Lenin circle that I came across in one little town in Mecklenburg. So these things still exist, and others. I'm sure there will be, what can happen is there will be a Merkel Street. I'm quite sure there will be a Merkel Street. There's a Johannes von Weizsäcker Street, or there's a Helmut Kohl, the chancellor at the time of reunification, Helmut Kohl's street, and right next to it there can be Lenin Street. So there is no system. There's no systematic either toppling or renovating of the imagery or of the monuments and of the political representation of the past of former East Germany. And one exception is really very important. Whereas I said before that the monuments that were erected by the GDR, there is no system in it, whether they are toppled or simply crumble or whether they are restored. One exception, one systematic exception is the fate of GDR monuments commemorating National Socialism. Usually those survive, although for most of the time there is a very distinct paradigm especially commemorating the communist resistance and using the communist resistance against the National Socialist as part of the founding myth of the legitimacy of the GDR, of the German Democratic Republic of former East Germany. So very often these GDR monuments by today's standard are not really conveying the message that you want them to convey, but they are still there. And then of course, as an educator, you can use this for education purposes. You can take groups of students, for example, and debate the different solutions that have been found in dealing with monuments from another era and from another political system. So in Rostock again, there is one at a very important location, that is the Steintor, the stone gate, where the former Chamber of Representation of the last of the state before it was, or of the dukedom was before, just until the end of the Kaiserreich after World War I. And this is one of the oldest monuments, one of the oldest monuments commemorating the concentration camps here, and that's from 1946. And of course, this is not used anymore. But what has been changing is the rituals change. So here, this monument was one of the monuments that were used for flag parades, pledges of allegiance and stuff like that during the GDR time. And this has been more or less abandoned as far as the government is concerned. one exception is that the city of Rostock will lay down, which is rather modest compared to that, will lay down a wreath on the day of the liberation of Auschwitz on January 27th, and then a rather leftist or left-wing organization of the civil society that is focusing on survivors from the concentration camp and their memory. They will have a small ceremony there by themselves as well, but that's something you can do. You can take you can take a group of that shares an interest and go to a certain monument and pay your reverence there. Let's forget about the Todesmarsch, that's also important, but let's turn to the right-hand side. There was, over the entire duration of the GDR, there was this focus, as I said before, on the communist resistance. And this shifted a little bit at the very end of the German Democratic Republic. The 50 years of Reichskristallnacht, of the first big pogroms, anti-Jewish pogrom, state-sponsored anti-Jewish pogrom in 1938, was used by the GDR to commission a monument at every former Jewish community that existed and that was erased in 1942 usually, and for 1941, 1942, 1943. So this is the Rostock example, commemorating that, and this of course stayed. So these monuments that were erected in 1988, all of them, so as far as I know, all of them survive and are still more or less taken up by the subsequent democratic system. That's the example in another town in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Stralsund. And as you see, and this is, I wouldn't call this civil society, but it shows the pluralism. If you think that your position cannot be openly expressed even in democracy, and this is certainly true for the use of the swastika and for anti-Semitic writing as here, but it's a sign of that this happens. So even the extremely right-wing opposition will use traditional forms of desecrating monuments. So they will desecrate graveyards, gravestones, and monuments like that. So there is, this too is part of the pluralization, although this is of course a kind of pluralization most of us wouldn't want. And as I said before, there were some, or not, I didn't say it before, but I just indicated that I would show you that some of these pictures. There were some monuments newly erected, as you see, rather modest. This is not the kind of heroic monument that you saw before, commemorating the soldier or the Navy soldier revolt in 1918. But this is a rather modest obelisk commemorating those who had to flee Eastern Europe and couldn't settle in Eastern Europe anymore, or in Central Eastern Europe. And this is something very similar. The Vertriebe, that's the word, that's a very, very modest stone in Rostock, but it is something you can show. That is, you can present this in the public. So these were some examples, many of them taken from Rostock, to give you an insight about how is, what does it mean to have a pluralization of collective memory, of cultural memory in the new Berlin Republic. I still have lots and lots to show, but I would make a cut here and just wonder if you had questions maybe.
Yes, it's more of a comment, I guess, that I not so much.
Interesting.
It's just very interesting to see how these debates about commemoration and toppling statues or keeping them, and what to keep and what to get rid of, and it's interesting to see how those have been so present in Germany for many, so since even before, I guess, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and how that applies to us in Canada, because we've seen a lot of debate about that in recent years in Canada, about what to do about statues, for example, that commemorate people who are now found to be who had slaves or who have mistreated indigenous people. And so it's just very interesting to see how these debates about commemoration are found everywhere, and how they've been in Germany for so long and now are just really crossing the Atlantic to even the US and to Canada. It's just very interesting.
I mean, all of us have, or many of us have followed the debate in the US during the Trump years, Obama years, and Biden years on the way what to do with statues commemorating leaders of or generals of the Confederacy, of course. And there, of course, now they have the phase of toppling monuments. And that's kind of interesting because there's alternatives to that. And I may show you one alternative to toppling monuments. One thing is to, well, of course, there are anti-monuments, that too. So I don't have a picture of that, but for example, there is a monument in there's a war monument from 1936 in the center of Hamburg, close to the Dammtor Bahnhof, which is very militaristic. It's Nazi time monument commemorating the victims of World War I. And this was in the 1980s, I think. There was an entirely different style. There was an anti-monument just put in front of him by Friedrichska, so a very famous Austrian sculptor. So what you can do is you can put another monument next to it, which will contrast the message. So this is in Berlin unter den Linden. What they did here is they had a monument from GDR time where a certain communist resistance group was celebrated. And that was resisting to the National Socialist regime. And so what they did after the reunification is they commented upon this. Very often you have a comment, like you have a plaque that will explain something. But here it's like the monument is redefined. So instead of simply toppling it or doing something to it or having a counter monument, they gave it a new framing. And as you see, it's an entirely different style. It's another material, it's another kind of writing. You have plastic instead of stone, and it's individualized. So whereas, so even in the Berlin Republic, there was an urge to commemorate this this resistance group, but they wouldn't want to use the imagery and the language of the GDR. And so what they did is they individualized it. So as I just said, they changed the material and they gave the individual names. So whereas in the GDR time you would have like the anti-fascist group would be in the center, here the individual names of those who were members and who suffered and who died were put in the foreground. So this is also something you can do. You can play with the monument. In Rostock now we have, as in many other countries, there's a post-colonial group. So those Germany doesn't have too much of a colonial past, but that is kind of definitely cruel enough if you have followed with the genocide of the Nama and Herero in southwest, which is now Namibia, but also what is now Tanzania. There were a lot of colonial atrocities. And so there's a group in Rostock which now wants to get rid of the monument. There's a monument right next to the 1946 concentration camp memorial. There's a memorial for a for a traveler to Africa in the 19th century, who is now considered, of course, part of the colonial effort. And so their idea was, but didn't manage to get this through the city council, but their ideas was not to topple it, but only to tilt it a little bit by maybe 15 degrees. So get it out of proportion. So this is something that happens as well. Any other comments or questions or something you want to share?
I just wanted to say that Lenin's monument in Germany is very unfamiliar with Russian monuments of Lenin. And it seems that Germans had another idea of Lenin and how it should be presented?
That would be very interesting to go into detail on that, because especially those maybe not the Lenin, but the representation of these revolutionary soldiers that we have in Rostock, they are highly influenced by Soviet times socialist realism. Of course, you had in Stalin's times, as far as I am informed, you had this phase of abstract in the early phase of the revolution or of the Soviet Union. You had these abstract artists who would participate, and then you had these social realist. That's the way we call it in German.